is the experience. And so we're going to go back, because I think human development, how we develop as peace lovers and then peace workers and justice seekers is the most fascinating aspect of human life on earth. So you're going to hear some of this book, and it's all in that book, but we're going to give you some ideas. So I'm reading. As a lapsed cradle Catholic myself, Theresa, I was fascinated by the parts of this book having to do with your decision to enter and then to leave the convent. Nuns take vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty. You had such a deep wish to be a good person, to obey what you thought was God's will for you to be a nun. Let's hear it in your voice. This first passage is from your first weekend as a nun, standing with fellow postulant, that's first-year nun trainee, for those of you who haven't had 12 years of Catholic education, Linda O'Brien, who's with us. Linda, stand up.
Linda.
I'd always ask you to come up and do your line, but Teresa's going to read the whole thing. On a rooftop deck, they're standing on a rooftop deck at the Maryknoll property in Westchester, New York, which is one of the richest suburbs in the nation. I always envied the rich kids from Westchester, New York. You, Theresa, grew up in Troy, New York, an upstate city near Albany, a working class city. And it's not unlike my hometown of Rochester. It's certainly not a rich suburb. All right, read on, Theresa.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I remember, and Linda being here is so wonderful because we just had become not nuns yet. We were in the convent like 3 days when this occurred. And we were on the deck, as was said here, and I said, I remember the first Saturday night up on the rooftop deck, watching a young couple in a convertible pass by on a country road that went through Westchester. I remember saying to Linda O'Brien, later Sister Marion Shawn, one of the postulants, oh my God, it's Saturday night and I don't even have a date. She looked at me astounded and said, well, it's not the first Saturday night of my life that I haven't had a date. I don't know about you. Well, it wasn't the first Saturday night of my life either, but I was never able to quite get used to the fact that I would never again go out on a date, go dancing, or anything else like that.
But the next page gives us a sense of what you got in return for your surrender of these things that had been so important in your teenage years. And it reminds me of what you later as an activist with Blaze created for all of us who work with you in LA, the beloved community. And this is a great description of it, and it seemed to be your first adult experience of it. So go ahead and read that.
I began to feel the richness of life at Maryknoll, and I felt a real strength coming into me. It was very overwhelming to be around so many people who were so incredibly committed to their aspirations, and I was inspired and enriched by my own feelings of idealism. Even though I entered the convent out of a sense of fear of God, I had always had an idealistic strain and a strong desire to do and be good. Maryknoll nourished a lot of that, and it also gave me insight into the greater purpose of being a human being. I learned that life should be about discovering the world around me and struggling to make the world a better place. I developed an inner richness and inner spirituality for the whole 12 years that I stayed in Maryknoll. This richness was the most integral part of my experience. I was incredibly happy on many levels. I loved Maryknoll and everything I was learning about people, life, and the world.
She goes on to say that she never lost the desire for a husband, children, and family. Interesting. All right, yes, I know, well, we'll get to that too. But this made me think, Theresa, when I read it, about Gandhi. I've been reading a lot about his life because I'm interested in the development of him as the really creator of what we know as nonviolence. And he called many of his activities in nonviolence experiments in truth. He meant that he always didn't know the answer, but sometimes his experiments in finding the answer caused him to give up certain comforts or pleasures to clarify what nonviolence required him to do. And it feels like maybe your years in a convent were somehow required for how you were to lead your life later outside it. And I'm going to hand it over now to my husband, Larry Dilg.
I was an English teacher, so I'm going to talk from an English teacher type of point of view, or at least a reader point of view. And I have a couple quotes from Theresa, but we decided I would read the quote so Theresa can appreciate them as a listener and not just as the speaker. So, but I have a question first, Theresa. In childhood, you learned that God wants us to sacrifice, a concept that you associate in the book with giving things up because God wants you to. Now, that notion of giving up has a lot to do with your becoming a nun and also with your leaving Maryknoll. It looks to me like the choices you have made in your adult life have much more to do with giving than with giving up. What do you think about sacrifice these days?
Well, I think that, one of the points that brought me into a convent and made me help me to stay or helped me stay 12 years was based more on the fear of God than it was on the love of humanity or doing good or whatever, though those things always stayed in me as well. But really, I felt that if God calls you, and you'll see in the book the surprising way that he called me, but I didn't want to be a nun. I was having a wonderful time and dating and smoking and drinking and dancing and doing all the things that a teenager's doing. And but I realized that now, as I grew in this movement, I realized that fear is not the motivation. It's love, and it's really caring and knowing the world and knowing its problems and being part of them, being part of changing things. That is the motivation. So I don't think of myself as having, quote, sacrificed anything all these years after all. I think that I was fortunate to find the real vocation, and it's really to be here with people like are in this room, people who care about the world and make it heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and that's what we're doing right now.
When you think about the word sacrifice, you have faccio, the vice part to make, and you have sacri, which has to do with holy. So sacrifice is making something holy, a blessing, which doesn't necessarily say anything about giving up. Anyway, there's a lot of rebellion in this book that is, after all, called Sister Rebel. And in addition to protesting injustice and resisting governments, there's smoking from second grade on, cutting school, joining Maryknoll, which made your family feel you no longer belonged to them, leaving the convent, and defiance of people who insisted you shouldn't include your children in your work lives. Yet, most of us love you because of your kindness, your attention to people in pain and in need, and your penchant for joy and celebration. Over the course of the book, we discovered that your rebellion involves joining and uniting and organizing. In the account of your work in Chile, you dramatically reveal your transformation from child to adult. Torn between the fruitless desire to become perfect as a nun and your human desire to have children and a family, you talk to a nun who tells you that you're being tested in what she calls the devil's temptation. Talking with a priest about the same dilemma, you're told that God tempts those he loves the most. It's interesting, isn't it, that God and the devil are both giving the same advice? Earlier in life, you interpreted the story of Abraham and Isaac as a test of Abraham's obedience to God, as if being willing to kill your own child could ever be holy. At the same time, you didn't seem to pay much attention to Isaac. But after this turning point, as a reader, I noticed that you increasingly notice the victims, what we might call the Isaacs, the children under the knife. The next thing that happens in your story is that you learn, as a student teacher, that teaching is imparting information in a systematic way. Now that sounds a little dry, but it's really, Theresa, what you do so wonderfully as an organizer, as a volunteer, as a leader. It's not the information that matters most, it's the process. La lucha misma, la victoria. Right after that, you discuss Pope John the 23rd and his injunction to be in and of the world. You take us immediately into the Chilean hills, where you share the poverty and generosity of the people of the community. It's really a beautiful part of the book, and it's clear that your heart is open. So let me just read you a little bit of it. In some ways, living in the mountains was basically what I'd expected. The building that we lived in was completely open, like a big hall, and we slept on flour bags filled with straw. Chicken and sheep were always running around the farm, which was right outside, making noise all night. We had no running water, no bathrooms, no sinks, nothing. When we had to go to the bathroom, we went outside in the bushes. In the morning, we were led to a hollowed-out tree trunk filled with water from the mountains, with a dirty rag hanging on the side, and this was supposed to be our sink. To my amazement, I loved seeing how people adapted to it. Every afternoon, we spent 3 or 4 hours walking through the mountains, through the hills, visiting little cardboard huts, telling the campesinos when to come down to the schoolhouse. The next morning, we would hold classes at 9 o'clock in the center house. I believe this was probably the most transformative experience of my life. Much of what I care about today has its roots in those 2 weeks in Chile, when we went up to the hills to arrive at people's homes, where they had nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet they always found a way to go out and find a peach in a tree or eggs laid by their hands to give to us. Sometimes they gave us some mate, an herb drink that always scalded my mouth and stomach to pieces. We always accepted these gestures of hospitality, no matter what they offered. They used tree trunks as tables, and they would spread clean flour sacks on them when they were serving guests. It seemed so elegant under these circumstances. They were so wonderful to us. We saw their poverty and sickness and the way the patrons, their bosses, treated them. Some of them were afraid to come down to the mission because their bosses wouldn't allow them the day off. Mothers of 4 or 5 little children were forced to leave them alone in those little shacks all day while they went to work in the fields with their husbands, fearing that the patron would free them if they didn't. Seeing all of this greatly impacted me. I didn't know it yet, but I had been thrown right into what would later become one of the most important causes in my life. Now, following that, you're sent to an intensive Spanish course that involves 6 months of isolation. The beautiful colors of the hills fade to black, a black that you, in other parts of the book, associate with the nuns' habits and with the life of prayer. It's a painful section of the book to read, especially after your joyful teaching experience and the trip to the mountains. The reader knows you have to get out of the darkness. And when we see you dancing to Guantanamera at the end of that ordeal in that chapter, we're singing along with you.
Yeah. And so you left. You write that you'd begun to recognize, and others around you recognized, because you were physically and mentally run down, that you had entered the convent based on too much fear. And it was fear that kept you from leaving as you wanted to do. So you finally decide to leave. You left from Chile, where you were teaching in high school, after being formally released from your vows, including having to write a letter to the Pope. The day came when you went in regular clothes to the airport to fly away from the life you'd known and into the unknown. Would you read that scene, Theresa? It is unforgettable.
So I'm reading from here. Right?
Yes, exactly.
A few of the nuns came to the airport with me that night. Oh, I'm sorry.
You might want this for that.
It's okay.
All right.
It's okay. A few of the nuns came to the airport with me, including one of my best friends, Sister Rose Carroll, who would later be killed in El Salvador at the time of the massacres going on in El Salvador. She was one of the 4 nuns who was killed at that time, and we were best friends in Chile. I said goodbye to everyone and walked to the plane. I had done this in my nightmares so many times before. As soon as I got to the plane, I would realize I had made a mistake, a huge mistake, but it would be too late. This time, as I walked up the ramp, turned around, and said goodbye, I was crying, but not because I had made the wrong choice. I felt as if a giant boulder had been lifted off of me. I was so positive that I had done the right thing. I kept thinking, my God, why did it take me so long? I've done it, I'm through with it, I've made the right decision, and I'll never doubt myself again. On the plane, the stewardess came by and asked, would you like a drink? It was fantastic. I hadn't had a drink in 12 years. So I said, yeah, that sounds great. Of course, I really didn't know how to order. I used to know 12 years ago, but not anymore. She named a few and I said, yeah, that sounds wonderful. I ran it. Then she asked me if I would like some cigarettes. They used to give out little sample packages. And I remember thinking this was definitely my lucky day. I said, yes, thank you. And I had my first drink and my first cigarette out in the open. There was so much for me to think about, and I had a 21-hour flight ahead of me to rediscover who Theresa was after 12 years of being Sister Maura Killeen.
So you lived for a while in Los Angeles or San Diego? With your brother? Torrance. With your brother. It seemed a good place to have a nervous breakdown. Then you rented a house with others and it became a halfway house for ex-religious and ex-clergy. Alhambra House. You taught, you did social work, you demonstrated against the Vietnam War and got involved in helping poor communities any way you could. You met Blaise Bonpane, who was known to almost everyone as the Maryknoll priest who left Guatemala and Maryknoll because he refused to obey a gag order about talking on what he knew about American involvement in overthrowing the elected government of Guatemala.
Can I say a word about when I arrived at my brother's house, that my niece, Debbie Killeen, would you stand up? Debbie, I believe, was about 3 years old then, and she had to sleep with me every night because they were a little crowded. And at that point, I was still kneeling on the floor every night before I got in bed and saying my prayers. And Debbie said, I'll do that with you. And she came and kneeled and said her prayers as well. But there were other things that happened that I won't share, Debbie. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Hilarious.
Well, Blaise and Theresa started dating in June 1969. Now let's just fast forward 5 months, pick up the story. After protests, we went over to Alvera Street for a drink. On December 9th, as we were walking through the little shops, I spotted some friendship rings. I hardly ever wore rings, but I wanted one. I found one for about $4.98, and I said, I'll buy this one. Instead, Blaise offered to buy it for me. Okay, then I'll buy one for you too, I responded. And we found him a ring for about the same price. At the chapel on Alvera Street, there was a wedding going on. Blaise said, now that we've got rings, maybe we should get married. Of course, I agreed. First, we notified his family that we planned to get married on January 1st. We never sent out formal invitations or made any phone calls. Instead, at demonstrations between December 9th and January 1st, we handed out flyers to our concerned friends. Some of these people invited other people, and we said that was fine. We hardly did anything in preparation. We didn't even realize we should be preparing. Blaise's 80-year-old mother got the caterers for us. We just pulled together this little ceremony. On January 1st, 1970, we got married at his parents' beautiful house. We decided to marry ourselves. That actually happens to be my favorite line in the whole book. We decided to marry ourselves. There were so many priests and ex-priests in the audience that we figured we were taken care of. We didn't have a formal priest. The wedding was absolutely wonderful. Everybody who was there in the movement, everybody who was there was in the movement. And we had asked that instead of bringing gifts, everyone should bring a reading or a thought or a poem to share at the ceremony. Everything people read was revolutionary. It was revolution this, revolution that. I hope you have a very revolutionary baby. Not everyone was charmed by the service. In a letter a few days later, Blaze's cousin Vincent wrote, "When they started singing the Black Panther hymn, I gave up." We thought, Black Panther hymn? What is he talking about? So we thought over all the songs we sang, and one of them was Born Free. I thought that was their hymn. Within 2 years of the wedding, you had given birth to your daughter, Colleen. Child raising is one of the great themes of this book. All sorts of people advise you to leave the children with babysitters or in childcare. But it's very clear that you don't want to leave them alone. You keep your infants close despite criticism of other adults. Later, when they need more space, you give them room to discover things for themselves. Balancing work and family is a problem for all of us, and readers can take heart from your efforts to do so with love and respect. So as you write, we wanted to be part of the movement and able to spend time with our children, not just leave them somewhere while we worked all the time. We had a different idea, that the baby was a part of our lives, so she should be with us, not a stranger. Colleen came with us to every campaign meeting. I don't think during that whole year we ever hired a babysitter. We took her everywhere with us. I tried my darndest to be a good mother to Colleen. She hated to sleep. She loved being with me, which was a truly lovely thing. And I tried to be a part of that in spite of everything going on. I think for a baby it was probably a hard time because there was so much anxiety in our lives. But we were desperately trying to be caring, on-the-job parents for her. When Blaze Martin came along, his personality and needs were obviously different from Colleen's, and that required some rethinking some assumptions, and continually balancing the needs of the movement with the changing needs of the individual children. Your book is not a manual of do's and don'ts, but it offers an inspiring model of how to maintain faith with large groups and intimate family members at the same time.
I agree, it's so wonderful to have you both here, because when we're raising our children, and Theresa was always my greatest advocate when I would say, I'm not sure I could do something because I'm breastfeeding or I have a toddler and I've been away, I've been working, so I have to be, and you were always there. And you said, yes, I understand, children first whenever you can do it. And then we wonder, have we messed up? Is it going to be awful? And here are her children. I mean, it makes me so happy. And, yeah, it just does.
Thank you.
And so beautiful, your voice, and, teacher, doctor, just making the world a better place in the ways they want to, not as they were forced to do. All right, we are going to read from the book, Theresa, now, and I'm going to have to get a book. Larry, could you? Yeah, thanks, darling. Share your book with me. Theresa said she's only written one poem in her life. She wrote it after she left the convent during this time of reflection that was so profound. And it's a poem, let me find it so that I'm not distracted when I speak of it. It's page 76, Theresa, in Spanish, and page 78 in English. And it's called El Salto, the leap. She wrote it just in that mode that you saw her smoking the cigarette and having a drink and having reflection for 21 hours on this airplane to become herself. You're gonna read each line in Spanish, because that's how you wrote it, coming out of Chile, in this immersion in Spanish, and that's what she had been speaking. And as she left, she spoke that and wrote in that, and I am going to, line by line, give you the English, and hope to do it with some rhythm that suggests the beauty of this poem.
Okay. El salto.
The leap.
Un salto
A leap
es como pasar
is like moving
de la luz
from the light
a la oscuridad.
into the darkness.
Es como pasar
It is like going
por un abismo.
through an abyss.
Es como pasar
It is like going
desde lo conocido
from the known
hacia el desconocido.
to the unknown.
Es como pasar
It is like ascending
desde el temor
from fear
hacia la esperanza.
to hope.
¿A dónde voy a llegar?
Where will I arrive?
¿Cómo voy a llegar?
How will I arrive?
¿Voy a llegar?
Will I arrive?
No sabemos dónde,
We don't know where.
no sabemos cómo.
We don't know how.
Solamente
We only know
sabemos que
that
hay que saltar.
we have to take the leap.
¿A dónde llegaremos?
What will we reach?
A la luz,
The light.
okay, a la luz, más luz,
More light.
al conocimiento,
Knowledge.
a la experiencia,
Experience.
a la vida.
Life.
Y el temor,
And fear.
¿por qué es tan potente?
Why is it so strong?
¿Por qué saltar y abandonar la comunidad?
Why leap and abandon comfort?
¿Qué hay en el más allá?
What is in the great beyond?
Saltaré.
Will I take the leap?
Aunque el salvo es la cruz,
Although the leap is the cross,
el morir un poco,
and dying a little,
llegaré a la resurrección,
I will reach the resurrection,
a la luz brillante,
the brilliant light,
a conocimiento real,
to true knowledge,
a la experiencia total,
to the full experience,
a la vida plena,
to full life.
y seguiré saltando,
And I will continue to leap
y seguir muriendo para seguir viviendo,
and I will continue to die in order to live.
y habrá
And there will be
una serie de llegados,
a series of arrivals,
una serie de vivir de nuevo.
a series of living anew.
Si vale la pena vivir,
If it's worth it to live,
vale la pena saltar.
it's worth it to take the leap.
Vivir es saltar.
To live is to leap. And that's it for our presentation here. Theresa is going to sign books over there or inscribe them personally to you. You will buy a book that's already signed by her. The book is amazing. Noam Chomsky has said once I opened the book, I couldn't put it down. That's a pretty good testimony. And I thought the same way. And so we invite you to maybe speak to Theresa over there. We didn't have enough time in the time that we have here at the church to do the book part and to do Q&A. So if you want to talk to her, ask her anything as you gather around the table and buy your book and speak with her, that's the part that you can interact there. But I will just finish up. Would you like to say something at the end, Frank, since you were the wonderful host without which none of this would have happened?
Yeah, thank you,
I just want to say we love you, Theresa, and we love your book, but Larry, bring that over.
That was fabulous. What the three of you just did was so fabulous. It was beautiful. Thank you. I'm here crying and loving every moment of it. I'm so happy to be part of this with everybody in the room. You know, we all kind of love each other. You know what Blaze used to say? The reason he did his anti-war work is he wanted to stop his country from killing millions of people around the world. And to love everybody is what it's about. Somehow that's what we, but you got, thank you so much for what everything. Thank you, Theresa.